Okay. So I'm going to switch this around so that.
Oh, and I also realized I am going to share my screen for like a second.
Okay.
So I don't think I can do that yet.
Yep, I got you. I got you.
Is the screen I'm on big enough for people to see?
Oh yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Oh yeah, it's huge. It's like a 80-inch television.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. I think you can see if you can share your screen now. You have
I
like
can.
the option?
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ooh,
Perfect.
I did not mean to do that. Okay.
That's okay. You didn't ruin the surprise.
Yeah, everyone gets to see my PowerPoint.
Okay, welcome everybody. So, hi. So I'll stand here so Tema, you can see me and see us with everybody. So before we get started, I wanted to welcome everyone to this Yom HaShoah in honor commemorating Yom HaShoah. We wanted to invite a speaker in who, through the magic of Zoom and because of the pandemic, we actually get to connect in these ways with someone who is quite an expert in the field of hate, and which is an odd thing to say, but in honor and in memory of the those who survived the Shoah and those who were the righteous Gentiles, and in memory of those who perished in the Shoah, we wanted to have a discussion, a lesson to learn a little bit about hate as it exists today, as a Jewish community, to learn about anti-Semitism, but also to learn about that most common of hate as well, the anti-Black racism that also is throughout our society here in North America, and especially so in the South. And so it's part and parcel of what it means to be a Temple Emanu-El, to focus on these kind of social justice issues. So I'm really pleased you came, and I think this is going to be a really good discussion. So I'll leave it to Quinn to introduce our speaker.
I use they, them pronouns, and I'm really excited to introduce Tema. Hi, Tema. So Tema Smith is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She's currently the director of Jewish outreach and partnerships for the ADL. Tema was previously the director of professional development at 18 Doors, formerly known as Interfaith Family, an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. It comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the director of community engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, Toronto's oldest synagogue. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Ford, whose writing has been published in My Jewish Learning, The Globe and Mail, and the Canadian Jewish News, and a member of the Nexus Task Force examining the issues of the nexus of Israel and anti-Semitism in America. And of the inaugural cohort of Shalom Hartman Institute Seminar and Writers Workshop for Journalists. She is a recipient of the J-Pro 2022 Young Professionals Award. She speaks and trains frequently on racial equity, diversity, and anti-Semitism for synagogues, Jewish organizations, and community groups across North America. She holds certificates in instructing adults from George Brown College and leadership and inclusion through the Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion and Centennial College. Tema lives in her hometown of Toronto with her sidekick, a 12-year-old extraordinarily stubborn Shih Tzu named Tashi, and his tiny buddy Padma, her pour-over coffee eater, and way too many books. Welcome, not Padma, that is your dog. Welcome, Tema.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you virtually. And I feel like almost a little bit more like I'm with you because I have moved where there is sun on my face. So it feels much better than watching you all sitting outside enjoying much better weather than we've been having here. I am really thrilled to join you for so many reasons. There are just, and I'll talk a little bit more about myself as I dive in, but there are so many reasons why being with you specifically today feels like a wonderful place for me to be. One is I spent this morning with your congregant, Allison Goodman Padilla, and my colleague, and she spoke so highly of the work that the community does at your synagogue around social justice, and obviously it being her congregation, it's a community that is close to our heart at ADL. It is also an honor to speak to a congregation in Atlanta. I have so many friends and colleagues who are products of the Atlanta Jewish community. And so it is really wonderful to get to Zoom in to meet more of you virtually today. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that the one line missing from my bio is an update, which is that I've now joined the North American Board of Trustees for the Union for Reform Judaism. So being with a Reform congregation sort of in this context also feels really wonderful. So there just feels like so many intersections between my life and Reform synagogues everywhere, and yours in particular. I'm just really excited to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and dive into a few slides. I promise I won't spend too much time in them, but I find it easier just to have some visuals so you're not just staring at my giant head on a screen. So let me get this going. So I really want to begin by situating myself in this conversation. This picture of early 80s vintage is of my parents and me. It was taken about an hour outside Toronto. If you know anything about the area, there's these like really amazing clay badlands that just kind of like appear on the side of the road. And my parents would drive out, for a day out of the city. What you might notice about my parents, other than their matching Birkenstocks, is that my mother is white, Ashkenazi Jewish, and my dad, though maybe it's a little harder to tell in this picture, is Black. He is from New York. He grew up on Staten Island. His family is originally from the Bahamas, but my father grew up very much encountering and facing American anti-Black racism. Staten Island, as if you know New York at all, is not exactly the most diverse of the boroughs and not exactly the most progressive and welcoming of the boroughs. And he also grew up going to Catholic school, a private Catholic school on the Upper West Side. So really encountering sort of classic anti-Black racism, despite the fact it being in New York City. My parents met in 1977, I believe, 78, something like that, and found actually, despite everything, despite the diversity of New York, that actually being an interracial couple in New York was really hard. And they moved back to Toronto, where they had me and eventually my brother, and that's where we grew up. One other thing that's really important to note is that we grew up not doing Jewish stuff for all sorts of reasons, but what loomed fairly large among them is that as mixed race kids, first of all, whatever judgment people might have about interfaith families, we were pretty easily identifiable as the interfaith family because of perceptions that people have of who's Jewish and who's not, number one. But also there weren't other people like us around. My parents had chosen to live downtown. They were politically progressive in a city that where our Jewish community tended to be a little bit more small c conservative, and also interracial and interfaith. So I come to this conversation from a very personal place, as well as from an area of professional interest. So I'm going to start by saying, I am not a historian. This is not a history. I will talk a little bit about moments in history, but if you really want to dive into the history, there are so many other phenomenal books that are out there, whether they are products of a moment, like Black anti-Semitism and Jewish racism, or Fires in the Mirror, or whether they are actual history or sociological texts like some of the others here. So I start this talk with the thought of with a statement by the late Charles W. Mills. He passed away unfortunately last summer, and he was sort of known as one of the philosophers of the 21st century. His project was very much a racially aware liberalism. So trying to sort of recuperate the liberal project, of course, being like, my head just went to French, like brotherhood, which already tells you one of the problems, liberty and equality. He's trying to sort of recuperate the philosophies of that in a way that are racially aware. He was a sort of a student of the philosophy of Emanu-El Kant, and noted quite persuasively, I think, that when you think about Kant's philosophical projects, so like the Golden Rule and things like that, that he really sort of tried to put into a philosophical framework. You have to remember that Kant was also an anthropologist who wrote really phenomenally racist things, justifying slavery and things like that. So that's kind of where he's coming from. And he has this one piece that he wrote in the late 90s called Dark Ontologies, Blacks, Jews, and White Supremacy. And in it, he writes, and we're going to come back to a couple of moments from this piece, but he says, we need to talk about race as itself a political system and the differential and evolving relations of Blacks and Jews to it. So that's kind of the frame that I wanted to bring today. Race and racial categorization is a political system, and people are in different relationships to that system at different times. So I want to pause for a second and give everyone the opportunity just to think about political and social identities. So some of those identities that we carry with us are our ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, gender, sex, sexual orientation, national origin, first language, ability or disability, age, religious affiliation, race. And if you can turn to like the person next to you and think for a moment about which of those identities do you think about most often? And my favorite part of this is thinking about identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself versus those that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. So let's just take like maybe 3 to 4 minutes, turn to the person next to you and just think about that for a moment.
But yeah.
Take about 30 seconds to wrap up, and then we'll have an opportunity for some share back. All right. I hate to cut off the conversations. I know I'm always the person who has to do that. But I would love to hear a little bit from you all. What did you notice in that conversation? Were there things about yourselves that you felt very strongly about that you don't think, in terms of your identity, that you don't think impacted the way other people thought about you? Was it very consistent? Was it easy to think through some of those topics?
So the Tema can hear us, we have two microphones.
I love the circulating microphone. It's great.
Heather, would you repeat your question one more time? Heather, would you repeat your question one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just going to turn my volume up a little bit so I hear you better. How was that exercise for you? So some of the thoughts that you might want to reflect on were the identities that were important to you and shape the way you think about yourself the same as how you think others perceive you, as an example?
Been a lovely person named Beth next to me, and we decided at sometimes in the context of where you are, like I said, I worked for the federal government where I was in a minority, so I thought of it in that context, more racial ones. And she mentioned that she works in the high technology, high tech, and she's a woman, so that might be somewhat different. And I'd also like to add something else that we talked about, social identity. This day and age, it's more like religion used to be, political persuasion, let's say, and how people put into camps and what have you.
I also think that how you perceive yourself and the identities that you think about most often change over time, because things that were more important to me at some point, or I don't even think about anymore. I take them for granted, and I think the people looking at me see are you a woman, and I also see that, and so that just take that for granted. I'm she, her, and I don't think people make assumptions about my gender or my sex, or my national origin or my first language, which is Southern. I've gotten to the point in life where people make assumptions about me based on age. And that can be disconcerting until you wrap your head around it, because we don't always think of ourselves in the way that other people perceive us. And I'm talking to Steve, wherever Steve went, and saying that, both of us have friend groups where our friends can be 20, 25 years younger than we are, or 10 or 15 years older than we are. And the ones who are 25 years younger than I am are young enough literally to be my children. So it's a different relationship to age than I ever had when I was younger, didn't think about it, or wanted to be older, or was glad that I was younger than I was for my older, that kind of thing. And then for me also, religious, spiritual affiliation has always been key in the way I think about myself, and because I've moved in circles where that aren't exclusively Jewish, I know other people perceive me through that lens too, which is interesting always.
Right. Yeah, I just want to pull a couple of threads that have come out. And one is what people can see about you often makes, and combined with that, what people can see about you that is somehow a marginalized identity. So whether that's about your age, your gender in certain contexts, your race in certain contexts, or when you're in a mixed group and somebody finds out that you're Jewish, like these are the things that tend to really, the things that set you apart tend to be the things that people most dwell on in their perceptions of you. And it's really interesting. One thing I will say, I've done this exercise in so many different structured groups. And one of the things that has been really fascinating, and we'll come back to conversations around Jews of color in a bit, is that very often in a group that is mixed with sort of like white, conditionally white, and I'll talk about that terminology in a bit, Ashkenazi Jews and Jews of color, some of whom are also Ashkenazi, but Jews of color, very often race bubbles to the top of what the people of color say, like that's the strongest effect on my self-perception and the greatest effect on how others perceive me. Whereas for the non-people of color Jews, it's very often the religious and spiritual affiliation has a very strong effect, but it is almost never race or religious and spiritual affiliation the thing that people think is what has the greatest effect on how others perceive you. Does anyone else want to add anything? Otherwise, I will continue on. Okay. So I'm just putting this slide out here. You've probably heard the term intersectionality a whole bunch. And I just am throwing this out just as the framework that I use when approaching conversations around racism, anti-Semitism, and any other ism or phobia. Intersectionality in its proper form, proper usage, is how all of these social identities that have marginalized identities and dominant identities intersect to create new and differing oppressions. So just like, I feel like the 10-second sort of clip of where the term was coined really gives you a very clear sense. It was actually about a labor law case where Black women were not advancing in a firm. And where it was a factory. And it went as a discrimination case to whoever was hearing it. And it was found that there was no discrimination. Why? Because Black men were advancing and white women were advancing. So it couldn't have been racism because Black men were advancing. And it couldn't have been sexism because white women were advancing. And so what was happening was, it was Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar who looked at this, said, is something is happening when race and gender combine that is creating a new form of oppression. And that's what intersectionality means. So as we're thinking through some of the topics here that I'm going to dive into, just wanted to keep that framing. So Black Jewish Alliance, these are probably really familiar figures to you all. And I'm starting in 2020 to go back in time. The headlines when Ossoff and Warnock were elected and then sworn in. Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff rekindling Black-Jewish alliance. On this MLK Day, the Black-Jewish alliance is revived. How Warnock and Ossoff's victories evoke the history of the Black freedom struggle. John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock are a heroic new Black Jewish, et cetera, et cetera. George's Black Jewish campaign is a later chapter in et cetera, et cetera. And you know, this tweet about how John Ossoff was sworn in on a copy of the Tanakh that belonged to Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, a civil rights activist and close ally of Dr. King. So very much trying to situate this in a long and storied history of Jewish Black relations. So I want to start by sort of framing a handful of myths and realities. We obviously have the famous Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel praying with his feet in Selma, really marching side by side and having this deep spiritually driven commitment to civil rights that really he was a thought leader in Jewish community at the time. This is unequivocally true. We also know that the majority of the white freedom riders were Jewish, or a disproportionate number of them. And at the same time, there were growing tensions between the Black and Jewish community at the time. So I'm going to dive a little bit into them, but I just want to start with this little quote from James Baldwin, who's trying to analyze this increase in anti-Semitism coming from the Black community in the late 60s. And he writes, "The ultimate hope for a genuine Black-white dialogue in this country lies in the recognition that the driven European serf merely created another serf here and created him on the basis of color. No one can deny that the Jew was a party to this, but it is senseless to assert that this was because of his Jewishness. One can be disappointed in the Jew if one is romantic enough for not having learned from history. But if people did learn from history, history would be very different." Around the same time, Albert Vorspan, who was one of the founders of what is now the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, wrote a piece. Both of these are in that orange book that was in my first slide, and I'll make sure you get these slides. He writes, "The flood of Jews to suburbia has left another problem which exacerbates Black-Jewish relations. The existential human context between Jews and Negroes in the inner city are merchant-customer, landlord-tenant, social worker-client. These are inherently tense, unequal relations. They are fraught with conflict and resentment. Jews in the core neighborhoods are represented by landlords and pawnbrokers and small merchants." And at the same time, or actually a few years earlier, Rabbi Heschel, and this is actually at the conference where he met Martin Luther King, says there are several ways of dealing with our bad conscience. He's talking about racism here. We can extenuate our responsibility. We can keep the Negro out of our sight. We can alleviate our qualms by pointing to the progress made. We can delegate the responsibility to the courts. We can silence our conscience by cultivating indifference. We can dedicate our minds to issues of a far more sublime nature. And he he diagnoses pretty clearly that a lot of people are trying with number one and number two. So extenuating responsibility, like how can we control this, and sort of de facto segregation, if out of sight, out of mind. Now, where does this all lead? So Eric Ward, who is a fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center and runs the Western States Law Center, talks about sort of this relationship that's becoming increasingly more fractious. And I just want to point to sort of the key threads that go through those three 1960s texts, which is that Jews are becoming more and more able through the 60s to live in places where that are not accessible to Black people, and are maintaining some relationships in their previous Black neighborhood or their previous racially mixed neighborhoods where they no longer live. Eric says that as many in the Jewish community entered the 70s. And so, of course, there's all sorts of stuff about the legal changes and who had access to housing in what neighborhoods, the concept or the phenomenon of white flight, where certain people were given more access to housing loans and were able to move to suburbs, and redlining prevented Black people from doing the same. And all of this is happening through the latter half of the 60s. And Eric says, as he's talking about anti-Semitism, as many in the Jewish community entered the 70s, they found themselves facing less, not none, but lesser discrimination. Jews found themselves in a situation where they were being defined as white, not only by white society, but also by anti-racist and elements of the political left as well. So he sort of says, he goes on to talk about how Jews found themselves without a place to talk about anti-Semitism. The final stages of the fracture around the time that Eric is talking about here are actually largely around two things in the Jewish community. One is a changing perception for a million and one different reasons that we do not have time to talk about today, but of Israel after the 1967 and 72 wars, and a rise in Black nationalism. Ironically, if you read Mark Dollinger's book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Jewish communities also and Black communities also learned a lot from each other in those nationalisms. Really fascinating stuff. So this is kind of the final stages of the fracture. So where does that leave us? Well, we know that things went pretty quickly downhill through the 80s, and things and the communities, while there are many, many alliances that still exist, you know, I work at the ADL, we work very frequently with the NAACP and the Urban League, but the Crown Heights riots became a flashpoint. The rise of the Nation of Islam, which really came to a height in the 90s, and so on and so forth. And this continues to today. Many of you might remember a few years ago, the huge amount of tension between the Jewish community and the Women's March leadership for their sympathy towards the Nation of Islam and general hostility towards, for example, Zionism. So how did we get here? So the framework that I have been using to sort of try and understand this is a framework of understanding the differences in the ways that anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism have functioned in America. And in many ways, that came down to social exclusion versus legal exclusion. So legal exclusion means you're not allowed to own property. You don't have the right to marry white people in this context. The right to vote is restricted. It is by law. Breaking this would have criminal penalties. Social exclusions are things more like private club restrictions, neighborhood covenants keeping Jews out. Same obviously goes for things like university quotas and not being able to access services and things like that. Employment restrictions. This is de facto. You are excluded because people have decided, and the consequences are social and civic, but not legal. Social exclusion sort of does not have to be, or say it's sort of separating these two categories doesn't mean that one is less impactful and less dangerous. These are signs from the 40s. Meadowbrook, approved Gentiles only in the swimming club. And in Quebec, here in Canada, the notice Jews are not wanted here in Saint-Agathe, so scram while the going is good, is a pretty clear threat of violence. And in French, if you don't read French, what it says is Jews aren't wanted here. Saint-Agathe is a French-Canadian village, and we're going to keep it that way. So that's a pretty clear threat of violence. Legal exclusion, on the other hand, looks like Jim Crow. It also looks like anti-miscegenation laws, which were only struck down in the late 60s with the Loving versus Virginia case. And what's really interesting is even in places where legal restrictions did not necessarily exist, for anti-miscegenation laws, there were other ways that the law intervened to sort of keep the racial line drawn. There's this really fascinating case from 1925 in New York, the Rhinelander case, where Leonard Rhinelander, who you see in the top corner, came from a wealthy family and married this woman, Alice, and he filed for an annulment. Because obviously divorce was not allowed, he filed for an annulment, and he had to prove the reason that annulment would be valid in this case. And he accused her of fraud by not revealing her racial identity. And the picture that you see on the bottom is this like very dramatic moment in this trial where they cleared the gallery and had her come out in front of the jurors and strip so that they would see whether he ought to have known by looking at her naked body, because they both confessed to premarital relations. He ought to have known in advance that she was part Black. So even the outcome of the case itself doesn't even really matter. The reality is, though, that the courts entertained this sort of legal argument that a marriage could be annulled on the basis of concealing your race. So when we're talking about racism and anti-Semitism, there's really sort of clear differences in the ways that they function. So we talk about systemic racism, a combination of systems, institutions, and factors that advantage white people because white people are essentially the ones who created them in America, and for people of color cause widespread harm and disadvantages in access and opportunity. Whereas anti-Semitism functions in a different way. And we're going to dive into some of the complications about whiteness and anti-Semitism, I promise. Anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, systemic conditions, negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed against Jews because they're Jews, conditions that discriminate against Jews and impede ability to participate as equals. So it does have some of these pieces, and there are systematic elements and systemic elements of anti-Semitism that exist. So when we're talking about sort of this breakdown, oops, I went one slide too far. Sorry, everyone. There's really sort of three flashpoints that have emerged. Whiteness, and we'll come back to Jews and the complicated relationship there. Who has access and who doesn't? So white flight versus redlining, school desegregation. And there's really interesting stuff also in Mark Dollinger's book around school desegregation, where Jews actively invested in day school systems as partially as a response to school integration, access to privilege, and so on and so forth. The myth of Black dangerousness, so reactions to anti-Semitism from white individuals and communities versus Black individuals and communities, sometimes elevate sort of anti-Semitism coming from Black communities to more of a threat of violence, whereas generally speaking, the exception, of course, being Brooklyn, that is not the case. Conspiracy theories and myths of Jewish nefariousness. So this is coming from the other side, so the Black community towards Jews, stories of Jewish involvement in the slave trade propagated by the Nation of Islam, George Soros and the Rothschild, the Jewish media, etc. Basically the natural, and what's interesting when you think about both of these is it's the broader stereotypes and racism / anti-Semitism of society having its own unique forms inside communities. So I promise we get to Jewish whiteness. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how that gets complicated when we're talking about anti-Semitism. So a friend and colleague of mine from the Nexus Task Force, David Schraub, takes what he calls an intersectional approach to the question of Jews, are Jews white, right? And I think he sort of starts by saying that the existence of Jews of color kind of proves that there's something called a white Jew, and that in some contexts, Jews participate in society as white people, and that actually is most contexts right now. But he says that actually gives us a new and interesting way to look at and understand anti-Semitism to more accurately fight it. So he doesn't say, are Jews white? He says, this is a nothing question. We shouldn't be asking this question. We should be asking, what does whiteness do to Jewishness? And he says, Jewish whiteness actually can give rise to certain kinds of anti-Semitism. He says, that said, white Jews have access to whiteness, even though it can go away at any time. And so he says, so basically what he talks about is the idea that if whiteness, because of the way systemic racism functions, equals access to power and privilege, then because anti-Semitism constructs Jews as ultra powerful and ultra privileged, when Jews become white, it accelerates that kind of anti-Semitism because it's the merging of two sort of powerful categories. Eric Ward talks about this a little bit similarly, where he talks about that the challenge of insisting that Jews take on this identity of white and therefore privileged, and what it does to allowing spaces to talk about anti-Semitism. And he talks about this particularly vis-a-vis the left. And he says if Jews are privileged and privilege is power, then what happens, in that sense, the only people who can be anti-Semitic are people on the political right. And, he says that in these sort of anti-racist circles, how could a white ethnic group suffering compare to what was happening to communities of color or women? And he reminds us that that what we need to remember is that Jews hold a form of temporal privilege, where Jews are given access, white Jews are given access to whiteness, but only so long as we conform and adhere to certain expectations of what that means. And he says, when Jews choose to self-actualize their own identities, the threat is delivered that if the Jewish community doesn't behave itself, access, safety, and opportunity will be taken away. And he says that clearly proves that there's something funny happening here with whiteness and Jewishness as well. I don't know what those were, sorry. So why is it important to understand these different pieces? And I know I talked about the left a little bit, but I'm going to talk about why understanding how to sort of talk past language on the left as well is so important right now, is that we have in front of us a pretty scary time. ADL's audit came out 2 days ago, I forgot what day it is, tracking the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents that we have ever seen. And what's concerning about it is that there are some incidents that come from the far left and some incidents that come from the far right, but even adding those two together, that's not the majority. What's concerning is all of the sort of people in the mushy middle who are picking up what's going on both of those sides. So why do I talk about the differences between the ways that racism and anti-Semitism function? Because we need coalition to deal with violent threats against our communities. So I sort of identify 3 places, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1776 project, because I think that one is a little bit less obvious, and the attack on critical race theory. Charlottesville obviously was anti-Semitic, the Capillary insurrection, people wearing shirts like Auschwitz, whatever that guy's shirt said, and so on and so forth. And then we have things like the 1776 project, which was a response to the 1619 project, and the general attack on, in quotes, critical race theory that is happening all over the country right now. And what's interesting in the 1776 project and that attack on critical race theory is that what often ends up happening is this sort of intellectualized version of the Great Replacement theory. So the 1776 project is super fascinating. The Great Replacement theory, of course, is that Jews are masterminding the undermining of white society by flooding the US with undesirables. In the 1776 project, what's really fascinating is there's a whole section on identity politics, where they trace the root of identity politics back to, surprise, surprise, a bunch of Jewish philosophers, and say that when they failed to foment a Marxist revolution, they decided to turn to identity and basically teach Black people that society was pitted against them to try and overturn the Constitution by proving that it was racist at its core. It's super fascinating to read and really concerning. Now, the last thing, and I want to open up because I've covered a whole bunch of stuff because I wanted to make sure to get as much in tonight as possible. When we talk about Black Jewish relations, and we've talked a little bit about Jews of color, we also have to remember there are two distinct communities. Dialogue, intercommunity understanding, and alliance is important, but what this does is assumes a monolithic Jewish identity as racially white and a monolithic Black identity as not Jewish. Jews of color, Black and mixed race Jews by birth, by conversion, a growing portion of the American Jewish community have been part of the community for a long time. So Black Jews are often asking, how do you talk about intercommunity when you ignore overlap? How do you, recognizing that Black Jews face anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism inside of our communities and from the outside? And that there's also an expected compartmentalization of identities. So where's the Jewish community today? I just want to sort of bring some of this stuff about like where we are with this coalition and these understandings of racism, anti-Semitism, the intersection, the differences. The Jewish community is looking inward. We're spending tons of time looking inward. Advocacy. So for example, broad support for reparations, resolution at the URJ biennial in 2019. ADL lobbies for voting rights, showing up for anti-racism. So I have spoken to many anti-racism committees and reading groups at synagogues. And anti-Semitism, very high concern about the highest level of anti-Semitism on record, along with that feeling of being unheard in social justice spaces. And there's a lot to be hopeful about fighting against racism and anti-Semitism inside our community. And there are things to be concerned about that can make for new flashpoints. So I'll start with what I'm hopeful about. I love putting these two pictures together. This is actually an accident that they parallel each other so nicely. One is, of course, the March in Washington. That's Rabbi Eisendrath holding the Torah. And on the other side was the Women's March after the large Jewish community, sort of, I'm going to say, vocal concern about anti-Semitism in the Women's March. It was a group of Jewish women of color who intervened and ultimately had anti-Semitism added as a pillar. And they were invited to lead the Women's March. And the woman you see on the side holding the Torah is Shahana McKinney-Baldwin, who is one of the people who coined the term Jew of color. At the same time, there are all of those flashpoints I spoke about earlier still exist, as well as some of the challenges and new flashpoints that have been generated by the fracture between the communities. So I hear very often a lot of sort of whataboutism of when people want to talk about experiences of racism, hearing, well, what about anti-Semitism, or but the Black Lives Matter movement is anti-Israel, or whatever it might be, that sort of actually doesn't allow for that bridge across a difference to be made. It's saying like, we are going to turn inward because we can't trust the outside world in some ways, and vice versa. On the other side, a sense of not being able to relate because of all of the social differences between communities. So where to? Charles Mills ends that piece that we started with by saying, to the Black community, I would say this: the narrative of oppression we have inherited from hundreds of years of slavery and subjugation in the West is in danger of degeneration, needs to be redirected against the appropriate target. We betray those who gave their lives in the struggle against racism if we embrace racist and anti-Semitic ideas. And then he says, we need to condemn anti-Semitism coming from the Black community. And then he turns to the Jewish community and he says, to the Jewish community, while always keeping alive the memory of the Jewish Holocaust, recognizing the continuing danger of anti-Semitism, including Black anti-Semitism, you need to update the traditional narrative of Jewish victimization. Updating your narrative means recognizing that, in addition to your own heroic efforts, part of the reason for your success on this continent is that doors have been opened to you that were closed to non-whites. Your moral responsibility as members of society, indeed the responsibility of all white people of goodwill, is to throw your political and organizational weight behind the opening of these doors to everyone, so that Blackness, whiteness, and Jewishness will be equally connected to, and therefore equally disconnected from, personhood. Meaning, if everyone is equal, then what you are racially doesn't actually have an impact on how much you are seen as a person. All races and ethnicities will have an equal chance in a non-racial polity, and the shameful dark ontology inherited from the shadowed and divided Enlightenment will disappear in a blaze of egalitarian light. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. So all of that is to say, in a sort of collage format, we have this beautiful history of alliance that also has a fractious history that also ignores the stories of the people who have always occupied both communities. And we are in a new moment with rising threats where both of those things, the alliance and the fractiousness, are still very, very, very present. And actually, in some cases, the fractiousness is still winning. And why we started with social location and social identity is that I really hope, if there's one thing that you take away today, it's that understanding who we are and how we're perceived in these sort of social justice conversations, in these alliances, has a massive impact on the way that we are able to reach across difference. So I'm going to stop talking because I've talked a lot and open the floor for questions, comments, reflections, and all of those kinds of things. I did not mean to talk for this long.
Can you talk a little bit about the showing up
Yeah.
you mentioned? Because I think, and this comes into anti-Semitic conversations, or to deal with anti-Semitism, and also with Black-Jewish relationships of who has to show up for whom in order for there to be discussion, and what's the reciprocity that we need to give and take?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I see very much everything in the context of coalition, solidarity, and relationship. When we think about anti-Semitism, which I spend most of my time thinking about these days, we are more likely to get understanding of what our community is facing, to get people showing up for us, to get people helping us in the fight when they see it as part of their fight too. And what that means is drawing those linkages. What that means is also showing up when something happens to other communities. I'm going to give a really ordinary example, but I think it's a beautiful example. Here in Toronto, there was a really horrific mosque attack here in Canada. I'm going to say 5 years ago, in Quebec City, where a number of worshipers were shot at a mosque. And the rabbi of the congregation that I worked at the time picked up the phone to the local imam and said, we're coming next Friday, and we're going to surround your community in solidarity and as a sign that we're here to protect you. And she ended up being invited in as a woman rabbi to address the men at prayer. It was the first time a woman had ever addressed the men at prayer. When Pittsburgh happened, the imam called her and showed up. That has led to some joint activism. Now, I'm not going to say this was all easy, because guess what? Like many of us experienced, some of those relationships fell apart. Surprise, surprise, in May of last year with the flare up in Gaza. Now, I might be an optimist, But one of the things that I really think has happened with some of this discourse around Israel is, first of all, there's so much propaganda, so much of the propaganda. My mother just did like this amazing download of like weird sort of communist produced pamphlets from the 70s about Zionism that she had picked up along the way working in the antiquarian book trade, that were in English, right? This wasn't like Soviet Russia stuff. This was like communist presses operating in English language that really have some of those ideologies, you know, Zionism is racism, et cetera, have infiltrated the way that people talk about it. At the same time, because of those perceptions, and coming back to the idea of social location, of Jews as a relatively well-off, well-educated white minority group, where our big difference is our religion, and not actually a fulsome understanding of the overall history of Jewish life, which is, you know, other than a few small examples in this world, mostly a history of persecution and homelessness, there is no understanding. And one of the things that I think is really important is building those relationships, even with the people who might differ in ways that feel really damaging and hurtful, because as I always say, who's more likely to listen, somebody who knows you or somebody who you're yelling at from outside the building? I've tried to do trainings on anti-Semitism for like student unions who have passed BDS resolutions and things like that. And very often what I've found is that they have no idea that Jews are anything other than upper middle class white people. They know that the Holocaust happened, and that's about the extent of their understanding of anti-Semitism. So, you know, when we're thinking about relationship and we're thinking about coalition, understanding the ways in which structural racism still impacts Black communities when we step into them, and understanding our relationship to whiteness and white privilege is so crucial for being able to not sort of say, well, we deal with the same thing, which I've heard, or we've got it worse, which I've also heard, which was like very hard to hear on the one side. And also some stamina in staying in things when you like hear really anti-Semitic stuff and being able to sort of build the relationship and push back gradually as you build that relationship and that alliance.
Thanks. I try to be optimistic like you as well, Tema, but I'm not as optimistic and somewhat very worrisome, like when you, on campus, the colleges when I read, I think it was the New York Times that the story, because I think when, and Rabbi, the word Rabbi Max saying show up, I think on college campuses, most of the students probably are Democrats and liberals, progressives, and show up if there's an anti-Muslim. They're showing up as social progressives, backing the minorities and the disenfranchised. The disappointing part was if they expressed positive feelings towards Israel or their race, people are not showing up for us. And
yeah,
you know, that's sort of tangential, or maybe it's not to what you're talking about, but you know, showing up has to work.
Yeah.
Always, not all the ways, and always, not just for us to be marching and campaigning or doing whatever we're doing for other downtrodden people, but it'd be nice for people to show up for us as well.
Yeah, I 100, trust me, I spend a lot of time thinking about the campus problem these days. It's very funny. Anyone who heard me talk like 5 or 6 months ago, I would just be like, yeah, I agree with you. And this is, you know, and now I'm like, yep, that's been like maybe 8 hours of my work week this week talking about exactly that. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We have a problem, right? We have a problem. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Campus is deeply concerning. And at the same time, I sort of keep coming back to, we have to understand that. So one of the sort of theories of solidarity, and some of the people who actually do really brilliant work on anti-Semitism on the left sort of point to the fact that in all cases, like fascism, white supremacism, I'm saying white supremacism like actually like racist Nazi KKK, not the sort of ordinary term white supremacy. All of these work by dividing and conquering. When different groups are playing oppression Olympics with each other and pushing different groups out of coalition, we spend more time fighting in progressive spheres than the right does. And this has been like, this isn't new. Like, my parents were both involved in leftist politics in the 70s. And every time I talk to either of them about this, they're like, yeah, tell me another story. I think the difference is with the proliferation of social media and so on and so forth, it's become more mainstream in many ways. That doesn't mean it's any, that makes it actually in many ways more dangerous, because mainstreaming anti-Semitism is very bad for our community. At the same time, one of the things that I think is really important for us to remember is that we will be more successful, I think, in pushing back the tide of anti-Semitism when we say, okay, let's just like not talk about Israel and Zionism right now and show up for voting rights. Now, getting thrown out of coalitions is a disaster. You know, frankly, I'm not gonna like, I can't sugarcoat it. I watched the Sunrise Movement thing happen, where they didn't ask any of the non-Jewish groups what their relationships to Israel and Zionism were. They only went looking for the Jewish groups. But at the same time, you can see actually some really deep stuff going on there that is the power of solidarity and coalition. They didn't win. The National Sunrise Movement disavowed that chapter's moves. Many Jewish organizations from the progressive sector were behind closed doors talking to Sunrise Movement, being like, this is why this is a problem. And in the end, no Jewish group was asked to leave that coalition, and the Sunrise DC basically they were told, no, like, you either share the stage with Jewish groups or you don't. So there are examples. I will admit that they are, the Women's March is another great example. You know, they didn't have a litmus test for those Jewish women of color leading that march for who was a Zionist and who wasn't. Yavila McCoy, who spoke on the stage, it runs ADL education programs, is a trained ADL facilitator. Shahana is, to the best of my knowledge, a liberal Zionist. And in the end, it was those coalition conversations that won. So do I think, I'm not going to say it's like a panacea. I'm getting too cynical for that. And at the same time, I don't think we have any other option. That to me is, maybe that's too cynical, but I think that if we, that we need to exercise the muscle of getting really uncomfortable with people saying pretty horrible things about Jews in order to move the needle and build those coalitions, because ultimately we need those coalitions. And there was a rabbi who I shared a panel with. Actually, it was Rabbi Angela Bookdahl, who I shared a panel with at AJC's Global Forum, right in the height of all the Women's March crazy. And so the question came up about the Women's March, and she took it and she said, look, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So no matter what's going on at that table, we've got to stay at it, because that's the only place where we are going to have impact and pushing back. So it's finding those cracks to insert ourselves into. And it's horrible. It feels like, as I'm saying this, I like feel so icky. Like I'm saying, like, well, find the least anti-Semitic person and befriend them and hope for the best. But I do think that there are like long-standing alliances and relationships. There are places where we can sort of say, like, look, let's work on this issue. And let's just hope that the work that a lot of Jewish organizations, ours included, are doing on campus will start to move the needle. You know, I will say, like, I trained a student union before I joined ADL. I trained a student union, trained two student unions that were BDS supporting student unions One of them, it like was not great. They tried to pass an even worse BDS resolution after, but they actually wrote in, I'm laughing, they wrote in an exemption to their BDS policy for kosher food because it occurred to them that Jewish students, for the first time ever, it occurred to them that Jewish students might need to access kosher food. And so limiting based on the kosher food suppliers' relationships to Israel was anti-Semitic. In the end, it ended up being like more anti-Semitic. And I was just like, oh, I mean, you tried. But the other student union, actually, you know, the Hillel table did not get protested. It was made very clear that they weren't allowed to do that this time. So I have some hope. I couldn't do this work if I didn't have some hope. And I'll say some hope amongst a lot of darkness. I hate how cynical Yom HaShoah is almost over now, but here the sun's going down. And it really pains me to say that, like, I don't love the direction things are going. It's very scary to me. And at the same time, I think that we as a community have the hindsight and the foresight to try to fight in very different ways than we could have in other places with rising anti-Semitism.
That makes me pessimistic, I think, is, and I'm really a very optimistic type person, I just don't think that there is a general understanding of the whole situation, whether we go to when the graph went up during, you know, with Gaza and people with the, you know, Israel, people don't understand, there's so much misinformation out. And I don't think that misinformation is just in the non-Jews. I think the misinformation is within our own community, and that's why our congregation is, you know, working on doing some real work on anti-Semitism and what it means and what it is and why it is to our own. Because I think we hesitate to speak up.
Yep.
And I think, you know, in business, I was, you know, maybe one of the few Jews in a company. And when somebody, you know, made a joke, I don't think it was intended to be anti-Semitic, but I had to make sure that they understood that that was inappropriate and that I didn't appreciate it, and I hope that they would discontinue, you know, speaking like that.
Yep.
And an apology was forthcoming. I mean, you know, it just, you know, what comes out. And I think that Israel does a terrible job of PR. Yeah, and always preaching. I mean, I get the Israeli this, the Israeli that, the Jewish, American Jewish Congress, all the information, is everybody always preaching to the choir. I mean, this information has to go way, way beyond that.
Yeah, I think about that a lot in the context of campus. And there's a role for preaching to the choir stuff on Israel, stuff on campus, because Jewish students feel isolated. So coming together to hear about, you know, Israel's not that bad after all kind of stuff is, I think, a really important thing for Jewish students who care, to hear and be together and hear, but it's not changing the climate. Like, you know, I'll be really blunt about that. And thank you for reminding me of all the work that you're doing. You're actually in a program that my department is running, the Act Against Anti-Semitism program. And one of the reasons that we put together that program is precisely what you identify. Jews, as in general, are not great about talking about anti-Semitism amongst themselves, and even more so amongst other groups, for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which I think is, you know, there is in some corners, like, well, exactly what Eric Ward talked about in the 70s about sort of the left, like, well, we don't have it as bad, so like we can't talk in coalition about anti-Semitism and our experiences, I think is like one place. There's also, I think, a little bit of a culture of like, when I say assimilation, I don't mean assimilation, but it's like a little bit of a sort of a trauma culture of like, we don't want to make too many ripples here because we have it relatively good. And like, we don't want to sort of tip the scale towards it being bad. There's all sorts of reasons, and just not having like a deep knowledge of anti-Semitism and how it functions. And everything in between. Sorry, my dog is trying to dig a hole in the couch. So you're about to meet my dog if you didn't meet him earlier. This is the tiny sidekick from my bio, Padma. So there's all sorts of reasons. And I think, one of the things that I really hope is that Jews spend more time understanding anti-Semitism does work differently than anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or any of the other isms, phobias, etc. It is a different system with a different history. And the more that we can understand that, the more we can draw linkages to other people's histories and also understand the differences. So we're not just sort of trying to fight different things with the same tools. And empowering people to understand more deeply what anti-Semitism does in a society.
Thank you so much. We could go on for a series and then doing this for, thank goodness we're working with your department at the ADL. That we get to interact more with you. And so that's going to be a really benefit to our community. But thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you. This was a very enlightening and important way, and actually somewhat hopeful. I mean, even as you might be, you're battling your optimism and your cynicism. It was still a very great way to conclude Yom HaShoah, which would otherwise be a dark day, with a little bit of optimism.
Yes.
I think you all can hear me. I feel very passionate about racial justice. And I am grateful for this synagogue, the rabbis, the leadership for allowing us to do this. This has been put on the back burner for too long, in my opinion. Just to give you, most of you are in the same age group I am. 1952, Cincinnati, Ohio, my 5th birthday, integrated. We invited the whole class. A Black child was coming, and the parents said, if the Black child comes, my children will come. We said, then don't come. 1960, John Kennedy was elected. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. My history teacher comes in and says, the country is now run by the Catholics, owned by the Jews, paid for by the Protestants, and enjoyed by the Negroes. Okay, now we're at 1992, Dunwoody, Georgia. My daughter Talia is graduating. A Black girl was crowned homecoming queen. The people in the stands sat on their hands rather than clap. Okay, so I am grateful for all of you. Quinn and I and Rabbi Max are working very hard to do this. I also have to give a shout out to them because you can tell I'm very emotional. And this has been an uphill struggle. They both keep me centered. They are both incredibly bright, incredibly well-spoken, and incredibly patient with me. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tema.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure Zooming with you.
Enjoy your sunset.
It's like 2 inches left and then it's gone. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.